A couple things to know as we kick off. One, I'm not very funny, and Christina was fabulous. So in vaudeville, they say never follow children or animal acts. I've just put Christina on my list of speakers never to follow. And the second is like anyone else who dabbles in academe, I've got 4 hours of material to get through in 30 minutes. So let's see if we can do it and get there together. So the interesting thing is a lot of the things that Christina was talking about are reflected in and around this concept of organizational agility. In 1990, the US military designed the concept of VUCA to explain the harsh realities of the modern battlefield. Volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous. It didn't take business leaders long to realize that they were also describing the modern business space. And with that, they realized that they were going to have to come up with something to counteract this volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. The concept of organizational agility was born at that particular time. This is about 2002. These are not new concepts. This goes back the better part of 2 decades. And yet today, we still have far more questions than we have answers to. When I'm done talking, you will still have far more questions than we have answers to. But the important thing for us is to, one, pick the right questions to look at, and 2, work together to answer them. If you remember nothing else today, ask the right questions, and then let's work together to come up with the right answers. So we start with the question of how do we survive, thrive, and win in this VUCA world of business? Well, we do that by starting to understand the nature of that world. Volatility goes back to the quote that Jack Welch had. It's the rate and pace of change. It is not going to slow down. It will get geometrically faster as we move through the next few years. But that's not the only aspect that's important to us. We also have got to be able to respond to that pace. And when we start thinking about that, let's look at a quick example. The rise and fall of BlackBerry. On the far left, that's roughly 2004. On the far right, that's roughly 2015. And we can see the revenue here has gone up and up and up and up until about 2011. And then something happens. They start losing the bubble, and they start declining in revenue and a fast fall off. So what happened in 2011 and 12? In honesty, nothing. It happened in 2007. And it's when Steve Jobs got in front of all of those folks at Macworld and said, we're going to bundle 3 devices into a single iPhone. When he said, subsequently after that, we're going to introduce the touch screen to change the way that we engage with that device. And then when he did the unheard of thing and said, and we're going to let AT&T have this exclusively because they're going to subsidize the cost of this. Those were 3 innovations that not occurred. And in 2007, the CEO for BlackBerry says, we'll be okay. Famous last words. Steve Ballmer at Microsoft said, nobody wants this. There's no keyboard. It can't be an email machine. He recanted those words about 5 years after that, and they responded quickly and were able to take back some of the market space that they had lost to Apple during that time. So we take this volatility, the rate of change compared to speed of response, and let's add in the fact that the world is not predictable. The uncertainty of what is out there makes it difficult for us to anticipate the next things that are coming. Well, I couldn't have guessed back in the 70s in my heyday that those vinyl things would be coming back as a premium high dollar value item. I'm rethinking using the B side of Pink Floyd's Backside of the Moon, Dark Side of the Moon, as a coaster. Those are worth money. Think about the disruption to the hospitality and the hotel businesses on the idea of Airbnb, the digitization and the privatization of where people want to stay on their own vacation. And we know what's happened with rideshare and how Uber has taken away a substantial amount of the commercial value of the taxi business. This is uncertainty. It's only going to get worse. But that's okay, because we're going to build organizational agility to counter it, correct? So we've got volatility, speed, and pace. We've got uncertainty, difficult to predict. Now let's add in complexity. Complexity is nothing more than the intersection of highly dynamic systems interacting with each other. Let's do a quick story of complexity to kind of talk about what that might look like. So we have a Tunisian fruit vendor working on the streets in Tunisia. And in response to government corruption, he has such despair that he sets himself on fire. It's captured on social media. It's transmitted to students who form riots and protests, causing the leader to shift. Spills over to Syria. That leader doesn't move. He attacks his own people, causing refugees to move across the world, and in fact to go into Europe, moving through all of Europe into the United Kingdom. And in the United Kingdom, already frustrated with the EU, we're going to leave the EU, causing a $2 trillion loss in market share on a single day, the largest in history. But that's not complexity. Complexity would suggest that these are not causal events. This isn't a butterfly effect. These are manifestations of far more sophisticated dynamic systems that's underneath them. Unemployment, rising dissatisfaction, both within the Arab youth and within the United Kingdom. Social media presence, the instantaneous transmission of communication. The resurgence of nationalism and pride of being a member of a country and a society, shift in the governmental powers, and then ultimately the investor uncertainty and nervousness around this whole thing. These are systems that are political, economic, sociological, technical, that are engaging and acting with each other, and this story is not done being written. We're going to see the ramifications of this for the next decade. That's complexity. And then finally is the picture of ambiguity. A does not equal A. B does not mean B. We have got such an inundation of information available to us. Remember the iPhone? This is not one, by the way. The iPhone launched a disruptive technology that puts the knowledge of the history of mankind into the palms of our hands, and all sorts of opinions and facts and factoids and fake news available to us. Now, of course, that's okay because most people use this to have arguments with strangers and share pictures of their cats. But it's that lack of clarity that makes it hard to make good, clean, clear decisions. And so if we think about that, let's take organizational agility. That's the topic of the day. These are pictures of book covers in the last 2 years that were written about organizational agility. My favorite one is this last one that pops up right here. It's 20 poems on organizational agility. And it probably carries the same decisive fact basis as many of the other ones. The problem is there's too much information and we're ill-prepared to process it. And so that ambiguity exacerbates the volatility, uncertainty, and complexity leading up to this. And at the end, it makes everything just fuzzy. This is the basis of the world that we have to solve, that we have to find a counterbalance that allows us to not just survive, but to thrive and win in that VUCA world. I said at the beginning, we have more questions than answers. It's important we pick the right questions. I think there are 3. The first question is, do we have the organizational insight to react to adapt to understand, anticipate, and shape that external environment? And if we have that insight, does it lead to the right decisions in a timely manner? Once we've made those decisions, do we have the dexterity inside our organization to quickly act on those, to put them into practice, to engage? Here's the big one. If we've got the insight and the dexterity, do we have the stamina to run the marathon? Can we do change after change after change? The transformation that Christina is talking about, do we have the resolve to continue to do that time after time after time, to combat change fatigue, which ultimately results in cynicism? We have to answer these questions, and we haven't answered them well yet. So what I'd like to do is to take these 3 questions, unpack a little bit of kind of what we think is important, and then at the end of that, invite you into the conversation. Let's take a look at what we can collectively do to answer these 3 questions for all of the business community. Let's start with insight. When we think about this, business analytics, strategic decision making, there's a lot of insight into that key aspect. How do we use it? How do we build it into our processes? How do we do one of the key tenets of leadership, which is to simplify things down into manageable aspects? Again, coming from Christina's talk, we start by getting the right people in the right place. Now, these are folks that will lead the agile responsiveness of gathering information of the outside world for us. The interesting thing is that they don't all live in the C-suite. Your field service technicians, your customer service representatives, your branch managers in the local community banks have got better insight on the ground into shifts and changes in the marketplace than perhaps the folks that the information gets filtered up at the top of the organization. We think of the C-suite, rightly so, of looking into the future. They're looking at the horizon, they're looking for the squall line, they're looking for the storms so that they can chart the organization's path through those to success. Yeah, that's what they're supposed to be doing. But in the ocean-going ships, we also have people manning the radar. We have people that are looking at the changes in barometric temperature for the things that we can't see. We've got folks at the ground level that give us that good information. We've got to get the right people in the right place. That's an HR function. That's one of the things that we can absolutely do. Now, once we've got them there, what do? We need to make certain that they're strategic thinkers. That's really interesting. At the top of the organization, we presume that they're strategic thinkers. My experience has been, hit or miss. But at the ground level, we don't expect or ask them to be strategic thinkers. And they don't have to be full-on strategists, but they should be able to see something in the outside world, to make sense of that and project it to some state in the future. That arc there is a strategic thought process. I see this trend, this is what I make of it, this is what's going to come. And then finally, if we've got that information available to us, we should be able to network it into the appropriate decision makers of the organization. Having insight is insufficient, and it's a waste of time if it doesn't get to the right people at the right time. We must share. And so it means that we're going to have to network folks into that decision-making capability of the organization. So I'm a firm believer that nobody remembers facts, but everybody remembers stories. So let me tell you, okay, that's probably just me, but I remember stories. So let's talk about this cool little company in Austin, Texas. It's been around for 30 years. It's called PlanView. This, by the way, is not an advertisement. It's not product placement. They're doing some neat stuff that kind of articulate what we're talking about in Insight. About 12 years ago, they started doing what they called inner circle. That sounds cool. I want to be in the inner circle. A-listers, right? They're inviting customers and potential customers early into the design process of what they're doing. They do software as a service for project execution and strategy. Their customer's voice is not coming from the outside in. They're part of the design team. And they live through the life of the product design. And they stay together until it's launched. And then after the launch, they have feedback on how well it's working. That's insight. They've got into the mindset of the people that they're serving. Over 12 years, they've done 30 of these. 300 organizations, 1,000 participants. And the CEO in an interview said, you know what? Yeah, it slows the process down sometime, but we really don't have to restart. We don't have to come back to the drawing board because we assessed what the environment wanted. That's insight. And the inner circle is the way that takes that company to that spot. All right, we've got the insight. Let's look at the dexterity. So, dexterity itself, strategy, execution, organizational alignment. Now, we start thinking about organizational alignment, we think about HR practices as part of that, correct? We're going to get there. But let's start with one of the things, again, that came out of Christina's talk was we've got to say what's important. We must be driven by a centralized intent. Now, you can call it commander's intent in the military, strategic intent, or vision in the business community, but it is intent-driven. Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin planted that flag in 1969 as a result of John F. Kennedy planting that flag in the minds of Congress in 1961 when he said, within the decade, we will put a man on the moon and return him safely. Your leaders in the organization must plant flags in the future. that we can align ourselves to. Even if the path is not clear, if we know the why we're doing it and the where we need to be, we can design and develop ways to get there. It's more agile and responsive. And that strategic intent is then nested vertically in the organization. The top of the organization plants the flag the furthest out, levels below, the flags get closer to today. And then it's shared horizontally, people that are bought into that. Now with that, we also have got to make certain that we decentralize the decision-making down to the right level. It is no good to do everything else that we've talked about, and the decision has to filter all the way up to the CEO with every gatekeeper where you have to sell them on what you want to achieve. By the time it gets back to the action level, your competitor did it 4 months before you. There's an art form to decentralized decision-making as well. It's not just scientific. We need to find out where the right decision points are, close enough to the point of action, yet high enough that we've got sound, wise choices that take into balance all of the competing elements of that. Once we've decentralized that, let's then take a look at aligning our processes and systems. So let me talk about the three that are the most critical: human resources, information technology, and finance. They're the most critical because very often they're the slowest to change. And we'll find artifacts in our policies, practices, and procedures left from 4 or 5 strategies ago. Oh no, we can't have an expenditure limit of above $500 because someone 12 years ago in our university used their purchasing card at a strip bar. That's a real story. But we've got a practice in play that's reducing our agility and our responsiveness based on a historical artifact. We've got to make certain that we align our policies, practices, and procedures in human resources, information technology, and finance to give those decision makers on the left the power to actually do what they need to do. So let's use a little story again. You probably recognize this symbol, some of you? Saturn, right? The Saturn car company. Now that's a very cool example. The CEO and his normal adversary, the president of the United Automobile Workers Association, thought we can plant a flag that says we can be competitive against the foreign manufacturing companies out there, because the US brands were losing not just their brand identity, but market share. And he said, what we're going to do is we're going to create this space in this little plant. We're going to partition it off from the rest of General Motors. And we're going to give them the authority to make decisions on the ground level. We're going to profit share with the craft labor level. That was unheard of in the UAW. Both sides worked together. They had it. They built the plant. And if you think about it, the mythology of that plant is as important as the things that actually happened. They would tell the story in early days of where a worker noticed a quality flaw, walked to the end of the line, pulled the big chain. I don't even know if there's a chain. Nobody could tell me where it was located, which stopped production to improve the quality of the vehicle itself. And in General Motors, that person is now looking for a job at the local Kmart back before they went away. In Saturn, they were cherished, and they were called a hero. And it became part of the mythology and the parables that they told to each other about what it was that they were doing, what they were trying to achieve, and the power each individual had to do that. So as we think about that, those aligned processes and systems, the idea of having centralized decision-making to make key critical decisions, and driven by that top-line intent, the fans of Saturn cars were far more rabid and loyal than the fanboys of Apple. They'd buy a Saturn, drive it till the wheels fell off, and then buy another Saturn. So it's a success story talking about how do we build dexterity built in and around that idea of intent. So the final thing we want to talk about here, resolve. This is the hardest one. How do we do this time after time after time without people going, oh my God, the good idea fairy visited the boss again. If I tuck my chin down and wait long enough, this too shall pass. You're laughing because you've been there. And I know that those of you who aren't laughing have been there, but you just don't want to admit it. This is common. And when we look at resolve, we're talking about communication, we're talking about culture, and we're talking about workforce development. Oh, does that sound like something that's of interest to us? strategic workforce development. We can have the right people in the right jobs with the right disposition, not just the right technical skills. So let's start by looking at that of shared understanding. We need a common mental model of why we're going someplace and what that place looks like when we get there. That's the shared intent, shared and disseminated, vertically, horizontally through the organization. That's a leader's job, and HR helps him do it, or helps her do it. Once we have that shared mental model, the next step is for us to look at building a change-based culture. That change-based culture is not just the transformation change that Christina talked about. There are key elements of it that we're changing every day. We create more fatigue for doing this anticipatory tuning and adaptation as we do the big changes. The big changes typically have a burning platform that say this is a survival event. We've got to do this or we're going to go away. We need to build a culture that gets us through all that. How do we do that? The first and best thing is have leaders that have these characteristics. They bounce back after adversity. That's resilience. They're adaptable. They think strategically. They're capable of setting a vision. They're creative and innovative. They are externally aware, and they don't quit. Those aren't necessarily skills. Those are dispositional qualities. We can develop those in our leaders, but we've got to make certain we got the right leaders in the key jobs that can build that culture for us. And then the final aspect of this is we need to have an integrated workforce strategy, and it is not sufficient to recruit and retain. That's the start. We need to make certain that in that workforce strategy, we recognize it's almost as important to hire A-level players for A-level positions deep into the organization as it is to go to the executive recruiting firms and get a new C-suite person. We need to pay that level of attention. You can't do that for all of your talent, but if you've identified a key role that's vital to the agility of your organization, you cannot turn that over to a contingency recruiter. You've got to spend the time and effort of getting the right person in there, not with the right skill set, that's a given, but with the right disposition, the right character. The other things you have to do in your workforce strategy, make sure that you're not following the falsehood of hoping for A while rewarding B. Your compensation, your long-term, your short-term incentive plans, the criteria for not just recruitment, but for promotion, for reward, have all got to be tied to the things that you're trying to achieve. And that's got to be built into your workforce strategy. Okay, so what does that mean to us? Saturn. They did great on the last one. The CEO left. The president of the UAW changed, and they lost their will. The resolve went away. People have been looking at Saturn from other divisions with hungry eyes. In the early days, those divisions were cut short on R&D funds because it all went to that Saturn plant. And once the protectors at the top of the institution of General Motors went away, so did the protection. Now, well, I hope you had a good time in there. Welcome back to General Motors. The culture at Saturn, they had to retrain and reorient those workers to try to get them back into General Motors. And years later, they were still dissatisfied with the parent organization. They didn't buy into it. They didn't sustain it. And it went away and died. So we've got to make certain that what we do has legs, that we can build it into the institution, that time after time after time we can change and not just manage it, embrace it, love it, and realize that is our evolution. That's how we survive. All right, so what does that mean for us? We come back to 3 questions. Those were just potential answers to those. Those aren't the right answers. Consultants have an advocacy for organizational agility, whatever model that they're working with. Organizations have their own best practices, which work in certain circumstances. And scientific researchers and scientific inquiry have our own types of interests. We've got to bring those together so that we have 3 communities working as one to answer those 3 questions. Do we have the insight? Are we dexterous enough to do something about it? And do we have the resolve to keep doing it? So I think perhaps the question for you is, today's Sunday. What about Monday morning? Well, I've got a couple ideas. First and foremost, I'm going to go back to Christina's talk. Start with your own HR team. The story of the cobbler in the village is that the villagers had the best shoes possible, and his children went barefoot. He took care of his clients before he took care of himself and his family. We have to take a lesson from that to make your teams agile, build capacity for gaining insight, and more importantly, how do you advise leaders in those key roles to develop the insight, to create the dexterity that's necessary, and ultimately to completely build the resolve. The next thing I would challenge you to do, realize that if the leader is perhaps the best influencer on culture, the second best is human resources. You're the facilitator of that culture. You work on the embedding and the reinforcing mechanisms. Make certain that you have clear in your minds what that enabled and agile culture needs to look like. And it's all about the ability to sustain rapid and recurring change. And then take a look at rethinking the critical roles. Yes, it's more work. The payoff is phenomenal. What are the key positions that you need to have to ensure the agility of your organization? And then ultimately, you come down to the last one. Teach your leaders to think agilely, to realize it's not A plus B equals C, that sometimes they can create the conditions that A plus B equals DEX. So, my last takeaway for you, we have more questions than we have answers. That's okay. I think we're asking the right questions. We don't have the team built yet to answer them. So we want to invite you to join our inner circle. So we're starting this initiative at the Haslam College. We're bringing together practitioners, human resources and operational leadership. We're bringing together consultants, and we're bringing together other academic institutions in a way to create an understanding of how we leverage organizational agility to survive, thrive, and ultimately win in a VUCA world. I think that's about it for my time. Thank you for not leaving in the middle of that. I really appreciate it. Keeps my ego good.